Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. New York City has been experiencing a rise in cryptocurrency-based scams that have had devastating consequences. The City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies brought together law enforcement experts who are working on this issue in New York, on the national level, and the international level to talk about the unusual mechanics of cryptocurrency scams.
The destructive nature of this crime is really, it's hard to quantify because it's not just a financial crime. It's so much more than that.
Private crypto exchange platforms have stepped up to partner with law enforcement in the crackdown.
A lot of what we do is transaction analysis and blockchain analysis. So a lot of it is based off of pattern activity.
Disruption can seem like a game of cat and mouse, but innovative approaches have allowed law enforcement to undermine massive scamming operations.
So your enforcement action has gone from $1,000 on one website to $1 million and 1,000 websites. That's a significant disruption to to any criminal group.
Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. Here's Alona Katz.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alona Katz. I am the chief of the Virtual Currency Unit at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. I am a member of the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies and its subcommittee on law enforcement and regulatory agency digital technologies activities. This podcast is being hosted by the task force. It's my pleasure today to have gathered some friends and colleagues and very knowledgeable people to talk about a cryptocurrency investment scam that is commonly referred to as pig butchering. To get things started, I'm just going to ask our speakers to go around and introduce themselves. So Inspector Nunez, could you share with us where you're from and what is your familiarity with investigating these types of scams?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join this podcast. I have 28 years in law enforcement, all with the New York City Police Department. I've worked on patrol, organized crime control bureau, and the detective bureau, where I'm currently assigned. I was also, prior to this, I was a precinct commander in two very busy precincts in the city. And prior to this, I was assigned as the commanding officer of the Real-Time Crime Center. I'm currently assigned a criminal enterprise investigations section, which deals with any kind of criminal enterprise, whether it be a narcotics trafficking organization like a national cartel or international cartel, a violent street gang, whether it's an old school mafia such as the Gambino or Lucchese or the other families in the city. So with cryptocurrency, we've been seeing an increase in it. And I do have a couple of squads that investigated and keep me apprised of the current trends. So hopefully I can add to this podcast my expertise and the trends that we're seeing.
Thank you. And Kristen, I'll kick it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Spaeth. I am a manager on the global intelligence team at Coinbase, and we are the liaisons between Coinbase and law enforcement. So my team is responsible for all criminal investigations on the platform, and our crime typologies range from everything from your, I don't want to say run-of-the-mill, but run-of-the-mill financial frauds to scams to everything else out there in the ecosystem. And prior to coming to Coinbase, I was at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office with Alona in the new Cybercrime Bureau now. But yeah, in that role, investigated pretty much every sort of cyber-enabled crime that went over a device or financially backed. I've been with Coinbase for about 3 years now, actually over 3 years now, and I still deal with Alona very much so.
Okay, John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Morning, everybody. My name is Jonathan Scharf. I'm the Deputy Chief of Major Economic Crimes in the Queens County District Attorney's Office, and I am also the Director of Cryptocurrency Investigations. I'm really happy to be here with all of you guys today, and thank you for allowing me to give my thoughts on this really important topic. And thank you also to District Attorney Melinda Katz, who has been very supportive of my unit and our efforts in expanding our reach in this area of prosecution and investigation. Just a little bit about my background. I've been both a federal prosecutor and a state prosecutor, and I started working on cryptocurrency matters probably around 2017 or so, when we first started seeing these things popping up with more regularity. So I've really been able to see the arc of the expansion of cryptocurrency and crime going initially from just a payment source for things like narcotics and other dark web items to now it being very ubiquitous and appearing in all sorts of crime at all sorts of levels, particularly in this area of scams, which is really devastating and really important. So again, I'm really happy to be here and be able to share my thoughts with all of you today.
And last in our introductions, we have an international guest. Adrian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Not quite international, but I'm Adrian Cheek. I spent 15 years in law enforcement in the UK with the Police Central E-Crime Unit of the Met Police and then the National Crime Agency. Back in the late 2000s, we were pioneering disruption mechanisms online, especially around the counterfeiting, anti-counterfeiting space. Since then, moved to the private sector. So all in all, been in this space for the best part of 25 years. Now I specialize in mapping and identifying illicit activity online, whether that's pig butchering, drugs, guns, prostitution, whatever it happens to be. Done a lot of cartel work, since it's already been mentioned in terms of the drug trafficking routes and so on. So it's focusing on the disruption pieces, education, and providing the information to the fine folks of law enforcement to help them disrupt the environments now.
And just before we get into a conversation, I'm just going to give a universal disclaimer for the group that all views expressed here are our own and don't represent the official position of any of our respective agencies. So I'm going to start off addressing my questions to John and Inspector Nunez to get the law enforcement perspective on this. And then I'm going to turn to our private sector partners. So John, I'm going to start with you. When I described the scam that we're going to talk here today, I used the name that a lot of us in the industry and in law enforcement referred to it as pig butchering. And I know there's some controversy about the use of the name. Can you just give us like an overview of how this scam works and why there's some conflict about whether we should be calling it pig butchering?
Sure. This scam, we first started seeing it maybe late 2019 into 2021-ish. And essentially, it's an iteration of what we have often seen as a confidence scam and a romance scam and an investment scam, sort of all wrapped into one. So typically, the way pig butchering sort of unfolds is you'll have a victim who receives some sort of a message. That message could be a text message saying that I'm a wrong number, or an email saying that seems to be directed to the wrong person. But we've also seen where they've been solicited on like a WhatsApp group chat if they have WhatsApp, or Telegram group chat if they are signed up for Telegram. And typically what happens is you'll have an individual, give some sort of innocuous message and try and start up a conversation. And then that conversation will sort of evolve. Oftentimes what we'll see is that there'll be a romantic connection that is first sort of created, where the victim is, usually is a vulnerable person in some form of their life. They've either had some sort of a loss, either a loss of a loved one, loss of a spouse or girlfriend, or boyfriend, a loss of a job, just something that has happened, a parent, something that has happened where the person is able to sort of pull on those sort of heartstrings and really like create like this deep personal relationship. Then at some point, that person is going to start saying, hey, I'm doing really well financially. They'll provide pictures and other evidence of how well they're doing. And then they will ultimately say, I was able to achieve this wealth and this prosperity through investing in cryptocurrency, and kind of lead that person down the road to thinking that they can do it too. And oftentimes we find that our victims are actually soliciting the scammer, at which point they are usually forwarded some sort of a URL for a fake platform, and they start investing cryptocurrency, but sometimes fiat currency, but all with the idea that they're investing in some sort of cryptocurrency investment plan. And these websites are very well designed. They'll have logos. They'll often mimic something that is known in the space legitimately. And they'll see that they're actually doing really well in terms of returns. And they'll just keep pumping in more and more of their funds into this platform, thinking they're doing really well. And then comes the point where they say, I've done so well, I want to take out some money. And that's when the scammer starts to begin to kind of unwind the scam. And they'll start with things such as, okay, well, in order to do that, you need to pay off a certain amount of taxes. So they'll squeeze a little extra money. Oh, it's been held up in some sort of, most recently I saw it's been held up in a mining fee. So you need to pay an additional fee. So oftentimes these people aren't that well educated in cryptocurrency. Also, they're not necessarily experts. So it's easy to kind of have these ideas pushed on them. And again, they're talking to someone who they've already established this really trusting and deep personal relationship with. So they have every reason to believe that everything is true. The scammer, as they're unwinding it, they will continue to just squeeze as much of money out of the victim as they possibly can until there's really nothing left to get, at which point they just disappear. And this can be really destructive in two ways. Because one, obviously there's a huge financial loss here. And we've seen people lose millions of dollars, their entire life savings, their children's college funds, their entire retirement nest egg, everything that they had counted on in life is gone. But then in addition to that, they've also sort of lost this trusted person in their life. So they're also dealing with this very deep personal loss as well. And that can be humiliating. It can keep them from reporting it to law enforcement. It can keep them from reporting it to their families. And in some instances, and really terrible ones, it's actually led to those people taking their own lives because they are in such incredible despair. So the destructive nature of this crime is really, it's hard to quantify because it's not just a financial crime. It's so much more than that. On the back end of this scheme, of course, you also, well, let me back up. So you asked about the term pig butchering or shazhupan in, I think that's how you say it in Chinese. And it's really the criminal's term. And what it really refers to is they're fattening up a hog with these promises, and they're getting every bit of money they can get out of these people, as well as every bit of emotion out of these people so that they have full trust. And then when everything is there and the hog is as fat as it can be, they slaughter it and take everything away. And that's where the term gets its name from. A lot of people don't like this term. I've seen a lot of law enforcement try and move this to like online confidence scams or cyber-enabled confidence scams or cyber-enabled quasi-romance investment. But that doesn't capture, I think, what the bad guys are calling it, because it really is as terrible as the name is. And I think we should sort of, in a way, honor that when we're talking about the victims, because it's not there to humiliate them. It's there to really describe how terrible a crime typology this really is. And then just sort of to add to that, on the back end of this, we know from intelligence that a lot of the people who are the scammers, the people on the other ends of those texts and phones, are actually themselves victims of transnational organized crime who've been lured with false promises of jobs in places like Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand. And then they're essentially held captive and threatened with violence and forced to commit these scams on 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And if they're unsuccessful, they suffer real consequences. So it's really a tragedy sort of across the board.
Thanks, John. So we will use pig butchering as we discuss it today, but we're certainly mindful of everything you shared. And I think I speak for everyone that when we talk about the scammers and the perpetrators in the scam, we're not talking about the people who are victims of labor trafficking, but the real coercive masterminds behind it. So since we're all New Yorkers and Adrian is a New Yorker at heart, I did want to get a better idea of what the statistics related to this type of scam are like in New York City and what the NYPD is seeing. So Inspector Nunez, what can you tell us about the amount and the type of cryptocurrency investment scams that are being reported to the NYPD? And what do you think? Can you give us an approximate dollar amount for the total reported losses for these types of scams?
Sure. In short, the statistics are alarming. And they're even more alarming when you consider the fact that we believe there's a considerable amount of underreporting. So the statistics I'm about to give you are for the first half of the year, up until June 30th of this year. We've had a total of 291 complaints involving cryptocurrency scams, totaling $21,095,347. So if that trend continues, we're going to tap about $42 million in losses. Um, and out of that amount, going back to the first half of this year, $21 million, we've only recovered 91,000. So that's less than 1% that we've recovered. We have made arrests, 22 arrests on these scams. But the resolution where we've gotten restitution pale in comparison to the losses. You have to consider, when you add in the fact that there's a significant amount of underreporting, that number can, your imagination can inflate that number. And I wouldn't argue with any number anyone would come up with as far as underreporting, because I think there's a significant amount of underreporting. And these represent, and I want to kind of speak that John mentioned. Behind each one of these courts, there's someone who suffered a loss, not only financially, but also in trust. When I was a precinct commander, I remember reading many of these complaints, and one of them involved a widower who husband passed away. I believe she was in her 50s, began an online communication with someone who was posing himself as a U.S. citizen working overseas as a contractor. He, going along with that pig butchering, he kept feeding her a steady stream of pity stories, sob stories. One of them I remember was that one of his, the operators of one of his heavy equipment machines ended up running over a child in one of these foreign countries, and he had to pay for the funeral of this child. And she forwarded him, I think at the time, $25,000 to cover the funeral expenses. And this just went on and on for months until she realized that she was being scammed. By that time, she had lost about $200,000 over the course of months. So behind each one of these 291 complaint reports that we've taken for the first half of this year, there's really a tragedy. You're talking about a widower who is probably living on pension benefits. Now she's out, and in her livelihood, really, what was going to sustain her for the rest of her life.
And Inspector Nunez, can you also talk about what is the NYPD doing, and what can they do to be more prepared to handle the cryptocurrency reports from victims that are coming in? Because just in my experience at the DA's office, a lot of referrals I'm getting about these complaints are from victims going directly to their local precincts or calling 911. So how is the NYPD equipping themselves to be responsive?
So the first thing we're doing is educating our police officers, our detectives, all the way down to that police officer on the street or who greets you at the precinct, that we do investigate cryptocurrency, that it is a crime, and we have the tools to investigate it, and that it's not just a financial investment. That's So we've started with training our detectives in the detective bureau, letting know that we do have these tools and resources and squads that will investigate it, but also pushing that all the way down to the precinct level. It's going to take time. We're a large organization, so getting that down to those boots on the ground is going to take some time. Also, the way we're getting that message down is training for cops, virtual training. We have screens at every roll call room and every muster room in every precinct. We can actually do virtual training right before they go out on patrol. We also have, we're developing right now with our training bureau, we're in the process of developing a cryptocurrency training video that they can view at their leisure on their police department phones or on the desktops. And lastly, we've updated our complaint report to capture a cryptocurrency field we added so that we can actually capture when a crime is related to a cryptocurrency scam. And that'll also, not only will it help show the police officers that we do actually accept these reports, it'll also help us analyze the data. We take tens of thousands of complaint reports, everything from a lost wallet all the way up to and including a homicide. Having our complaint report amended with this cryptocurrency field is going to help us greatly with analyzing the data.
I agree. Those statistics are really important to know. John, I'd just like to ask you about from the local prosecution perspective. I've heard a lot in our circle the phrase educate, seize, disrupt for how prosecutors are going to approach tackling these scams. Can you talk about what some of the challenges are for prosecutors in handling these types of cases and how that evolved to the educate, seize, disrupt approach?
Yeah, so I think both in law enforcement generally, but prosecutors and police, the way we typically view things is we have a crime that's been committed, reported, and now we're going to investigate it, find the perpetrators, arrest those people, and then bring them to justice. That's sort of the standard process for, I think, for police and prosecutors. And I think when you come to scams, really financial scams in general, but particularly this one, where you have this enormous international component, where you have money moving very quickly in the form of cryptocurrency or fiat currency, oftentimes moving overseas, out of state for sure, but oftentimes overseas and internationally, we realize that doing some of those things, such as taking the time to take the complaint, investigate it, and then ultimately try and bring somebody to justice wasn't really wasn't a very good process for this particular type of crime, because at the end of the day, it was going to be extremely difficult to investigate and identify a perpetrator that is on the other side of the world and actually bring that person to justice here in New York City at the local level. But also in that time, we were losing the opportunity to recoup the lost funds for our victims. So we realized that we had to change what we saw as a success, and it no longer could be an arrest and prosecution. Now we started to look at success as identifying the cryptocurrency that was taken from our victim, locating it, and attempting to seize it, and then return it, of course, to the victim as much as we could. But then, of course, the bad guys became smarter, as they always do, and they started to use techniques that were available to them to move the cryptocurrency faster, to swap it, to chain hop, to bridge it, and to put it into places that it became even further out of reach. And then we started to sort of realize that one of the things we really needed to do was turn towards education in terms of the public to sort of get out in front of this crime, because the best way to combat pig butchering, romance scams in general, or just any of these confidence type of schemes is to make the public aware of them, the processes of them, and try to stop it from happening in the first place. And so we really took a much larger role, which isn't really a typical role for a prosecutor's office, to be sort of out there doing kind of that education piece. That's not really our typical role, but it was one that we realized had to be done. And with that education, as Inspector Nunez mentioned, we also needed to educate our police officers at the ground level that this was not like a civil dispute over an investment gone wrong, but this was actually a confidence scam. And even beyond that, it wasn't simply enough for them to recognize it. We also needed them to ask the right questions at the point where they're meeting that victim, so that we can move quickly to try and do things to interdict the cryptocurrency that's been transferred. So I think that's been our big paradigm shift when it comes to this crime, is to try and focus on that what we control, which is the seizures and the education, because frankly, prosecution is probably more unlikely when these actors are in protected places such as Myanmar.
Yeah, those are some great points. And also, I think it's not one prong alone is going to be effective in fighting this problem. We need all those different components, and we need our public and private sector friends as well. And this is a question for Inspector Nunez and John. For a long time, cyber crimes or crypto, we thought of the investigation of those as just being within the purview of the federal government. But why do you think it's especially important for local law enforcement, the patrol officers, the local DA's offices, to be prepared to respond to these types of crimes?
Two reasons that, we should pay attention to this at a local level. First, many times, and I'm sure John can back this up, if a scheme, a scam, an incident, a criminal enterprise doesn't reach a certain financial threshold, the federal prosecutors won't be interested in taking the case, because it hasn't reached their threshold, right? And secondly, the reason why local law enforcement needs to pay attention to this is because our resources are directed towards the volume. Well, that's why reporting whether your car's being broken into, your house is burglarized, it's important to report that because we deploy our resources in the police department, whether it's patrol or investigative resources, as in the detective bureau, towards crime trends. Cryptocurrency scams have been growing ever since cryptocurrency came out approximately a decade ago, and they've been growing ever since. We've been seeing that in our complaints. And again, even with the fact that I believe there's a lot of underreporting, we have to we have to pay attention on a local level, because then we can start dedicating resources to where the crime is happening. And this crime trend is growing. And the only way we're going to be able to argue to get more resources, specifically in my bureau, to investigate these crimes is if I'm able to go and show my bosses and the police department this crime trend is increasing exponentially. We need more investigators trained in the investigation of cryptocurrency scams. So for those two reasons, we need to pay attention very closely and keep a focus on at the local level. And the third thing that I just thought of, another reason why I keep a close eye on this locally is because every neighborhood is a precinct. If you go to any neighborhood in New York City and you stop one on the street and you ask them, what's your local precinct, where it is, chances are they're going to know what their local precinct is and where it's located. If you ask them where their local FBI field office is or their local IRS office is, you insert the name of the federal agency, they're probably not going to know where there is or even contact them. So for those three reasons, we need to keep this as a local focus as much as possible.
Great points. John, you want to add anything?
Yeah, to just piggyback on all of those points, I think it's important to understand that the federal government and the U.S. attorney's offices, the FBI, and other federal agencies, Homeland Security, IRS, Postal Inspection Service, all of whom are doing a lot of work in this area, they're not really designed to take on the individual victim. That's what local law enforcement is specifically for, is for that local victim, that one person who gets scammed, for them to have someplace to go in and report. That's not really what federal law enforcement does. That's not their mission, is not to investigate one-off crimes. That's why we have police department. So that's a huge aspect of this. And so a lot of those crimes would be sort of not be taken up by the federal government. I think it's also important to kind of understand that what has happened in the last 5 years is that the adoption of cryptocurrency has expanded exponentially. So when I first started investigating cases with cryptocurrency, like, you really kind of had to know how to do it. You really had to know how to set up a wallet. You really had to know a little bit about sort of the functionality to purchase it, to store it, to obtain it. It wasn't as simple as it is today, where you can literally go on to a app on your phone and just buy cryptocurrency from well-known payment processors, from Venmo, PayPal, Cash App. Now the access to cryptocurrency is so much higher. So now the vulnerability is so much more, because the average person doesn't have to be sort of taught to figure out how to obtain Ethereum or obtain Bitcoin. It's simple to do. It's really a click of the button, and that has changed how it is being used criminally, because I think we would never tell like NYPD detectives, like, you don't really need to learn about like how credit cards work 20 years ago when we were experiencing massive identity theft. We never would have had that conversation. Today, all types of criminals are using cryptocurrency, be it scammers such as this who are trying to steal it, to people who are buying and selling controlled substances, to gang members who are obtaining PII off the dark and gray webs so that they can do check cashing fraud, and as well as general identity theft. All cryptocurrency is now part of all of those, what I would say, crimes that we were already investigating. So it's obviously important that our investigators have some knowledge and experience in how to investigate cryptocurrency. So I think the ubiquitous nature of cryptocurrency today, just in finances generally, has changed what is required of local law enforcement. Because again, we would never tell local law enforcement they didn't have to know how to do an identity theft case. So why would we keep a skill as important as understanding cryptocurrency from them in this day and age? And and I think that's where things are.
And the public sector and law enforcement can definitely not fight this fight on our own. We definitely need to be in communication and collaborating with those in the private sector who are also seeing pig butchering victims and reports populate on their platforms.
Today's podcast is brought to you by one of the over 150 City Bar committees. If you're a City Bar member and want to become involved with work like this, with creating programming on cutting-edge topics, with shaping public policy, or to build relationships with professionals in your practice area, join a committee today by logging into your City Bar account at nycbar.org and clicking Join a Committee.
So, Kristen, I'd like to turn to you. You mentioned before that you worked for Coinbase. Can you just briefly tell us what Coinbase is? And then I'm really curious to hear if Coinbase is seeing evidence of pig butchering within their system.
Coinbase, if for those who are unfamiliar, we are a cryptocurrency exchange where users can buy, sell, send and receive cryptocurrencies. We have a bunch of different assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum. Those are probably the two main ones that people are familiar with. As for what pig butchering we are seeing on the platform, unfortunately, yes, we are seeing it. And I'm just going to preface it that Coinbase, we're a compliant exchange. So we have a really robust compliance system and program. So we require users to upload KYC, so know your customer documents, alongside a lot of other checks and screenings to verify an individual user on the platform. With that being said, bad guys typically don't want to be using platforms that have all this background check, making sure that you are who you are, location, all that stuff. So unfortunately, what we're seeing platform activity that's victim-based rather than seeing the operators of these scams. So Coinbase isn't necessarily being used to hold and transact the accumulation of the funds. Rather, we're seeing victims send out these funds. And to John's point before, it's really easy to do that. And in these scams, these scammers are telling victims, send money to a known exchange. And Coinbase is one of the names that people do know of. And our platform is very easy to use. And that's kind of how we brand it too, because while we are talking about the bad in crypto, there is good in it as well. But because we are a known platform, it's easy to use. It entices these victims to really easily just send funds. With that being said, how are we seeing this on the platform? A lot of times it's not victim reported at all. And a lot of times we have internal heuristics that are able to pick up things on an account. Let's say, for instance, like some identifiers that we'd be able to see a newly opened account where a user wants to immediately send a large amount of money somewhere. That could be a potential indicator of it. But on my end, for my team, so we are the global intelligence team. So we investigate all this bad activity. A lot of what we do is transaction analysis and blockchain analysis. So a lot of it is based off of pattern activity. So you look at a user's sending activity. So if they're sending multiple transactions to the same address in a period of time or over a period of time, that can be an indication. If you're seeing those transactions increase over time, that's another red flag. And in the middle of that, if you're seeing let's say a user sends $10,000 in a transaction, and then that you see them receiving maybe like $1,000 back, that's what we call an inducement payment, which that pretty much means is that the scammer is sending a little bit of money back to the victim to kind of tell them, like, oh, you're making a return on your investment. But that just pretty much entices the victim to send even more money on the next one. So a victim might send $1 million and they get 2,000 of it back for the whole thing. So that's pretty much what we're seeing on our end. A lot of it is based off of law enforcement referrals. So law enforcement coming to us saying that they have a victim. Sometimes we have victims reporting directly to our customer service, but most of the time victims don't even know that they're victims.
And from my perspective at the Brooklyn DA's office, I really appreciate how accessible like you've made yourself and open to getting referrals and tips. And just as an example, I think last week, maybe it was Friday at 9 p.m., I sent you a Bitcoin address that I believed was actively receiving transactions on at least one or two occasions from what I thought were Coinbase victim accounts. And I asked you if you could blacklist that address Coinbase's behalf, and you responded almost instantly. Could you talk about that technique and other specific things that Coinbase is doing to kind of protect victims on their platform?
Absolutely. So we have an internal blacklist of addresses where if we know that it's these funds that are being sent to these addresses are going to nefarious activity, if they're receiving from scams, account takeovers, anything and everything, we have the ability to block our customers from sending to those addresses. So we are able to save victim funds when we can. So yeah, like Alona said last week, we're just on an email subject line basis at this point. She sends me an address and I know exactly what she needs. So yeah, I put it into our blacklist, and that way we can take one more step to try to prevent users and customers and victims from further being victimized. That's just one thing. We have a whole list of other things that are like, my team has been working on this for years now, trying to, and actually not just my team, it's the entire company. We do pig boat drink sprint, and we have done a bunch of them in the past. That's where we partner with law enforcement to identify activity that either we didn't know before or just try to prevent things from leaving the platform. So what does that kind of look like? We would look into anomalous sends from users to an address. So maybe it's, $300,000 worth of Ethereum was sent over 3 transactions within the last day or 2 days or so. So we'll take a look into that user and kind of work with law enforcement just to, is this victim activity? And are they sending to scams? And then furthermore, that's when we also trace the funds too. We've had a lot of success with that, where the one sprint that we did, we traced over $20 million worth of previously unidentified funds, and we made over 30 law enforcement referrals on that. And then additionally, we've also implemented scam warnings at the transaction level. When customers are sending funds, it kind of gives them a little bit of pause. Where are you sending this money to? Who told you to do this? So that would be an internal heuristic that could be enabled on an account if their sending activity is a little strange. We actually had a mechanism that we just launched last week, which is a scam reporting mechanism. So that actually prompts users to provide us information about the scam. Where did you meet the person that you're sending money to? What is like the domain or the URL that you're sending funds to? So we receive that information, and then we have analysts. It's real people, not just a robot skimming through things, that verify these details, that we will add to our block list and then eventually share with third parties. We've done law enforcement trainings domestically and internationally on like how these scams work and how they can work with us, and just to try to stop the crypto a little bit sooner than later. And then the last thing that we've done is we launched the Tech Against Scams Coalition, so TASC. We've done that with other industry partners, along with Meta, LinkedIn, Match Group. The initiative is actually really exciting because a lot of scams can be prevented from just simple information sharing between organizations. So last week during the Stand Up Crypto event in DC, we had a summit where they spoke about different ideas that we're going to be launching between private industry to be able to like really take ownership and combat this. So that's probably the most exciting thing, because at the end of the day, information sharing between industry, that's going to help us in like be able to stop as much of it as possible.
Thank you. Adrian, I'd like to go back to the mantra that we mentioned before: educate, seize, disrupt. And we've covered the importance of education and law enforcement efforts to seize. But I wanted to include you in this podcast because I know you are a real disruption expert. So can you talk first about what does disrupt look like in the context of these investigations, and how can it be successful?
So, I mean, the disruption aspect is sort of multifaceted when it comes to these kinds of scams. We've already heard that from John, for example, people want to make arrests, people want to indict people, people want to get people to answer for these particular crimes. But the problems being that they're often overseas, untouchable, maybe state sponsored, and so on, which makes prosecution at any level virtually impossible. The whole methodology behind these scams and how they operate is they have to be visible. A victim has to be able to, in some way, legitimize what this scammer is saying to them. Yes, the initial contact may have come through text or WhatsApp or some mechanism along those lines. The longer that conversation goes on, the more suspicious maybe a potential victim becomes, because I want to see this investment website. I want to see where I'm going to be putting my money, because that's how I shop online. I go to an online store. I see the item that I want to buy. It's not a physical item. It's an item that's actually there. And then I make a transaction, and then the item eventually arrives in my home 2 or 3 days later. But the same methodology that scammers have to use to make it visible from a disrupt perspective makes them instantly disruptible. They have websites, they have social media pages that they will push people to. Websites can be disrupted in a whole manner of different ways. They can be taken down, they can be seized, they can be just pointed into different directions. Social media, as Kirsten just mentioned, social media can actually do something about this as well by removing the scam profiles, by identifying the fake investment page, the fake bank page, the fake whoever it is pages that you've seen. But the key point is the scammers have to be visible. So as soon as they do become visible, they are a viable target for this disruption action. And as soon as you can see the patterns and identify the methodology behind each scam and each scam group, then it's very straightforward to see the bigger picture in terms of how they are operating.
And just following up on you specifically mentioned web domains. How can you start with one web domain, and how can that help you map out the larger network of criminal activity?
So the domain name system, the web domains operate very similar, in some ways very similar to blockchain, in terms of when you look at the raw data level, the data is true, it's uncorruptible, it's not falsified, it's just the data as it speaks. The whole point of these operations is that the bad guys expect to make some losses. They expect to have funds seized, and they expect to lose a website or two. So the traditional law enforcement approach, and I've been there and I've done these investigations in exactly the same way, is that a victim will complain about a website, that they've lost some money. Law enforcement will investigate the money and the website, and maybe they will seize the funds, and they will seize the website, which is fantastic. The victim has regained their funds. But what is often not looked at and is not investigated is the fact that one website is actually part of 100 websites or 1,000 websites or 2,000 websites, which are currently operating at any given time. And by disrupting a single website, in the bigger picture, nothing has actually happened to that crime group. You've not disrupted anything. You've not hindered their business in any way, shape, or form. So by looking at how many websites are there linked to this particular group, and there's many different ways of making those links using DNS as your particular platform. It can be email addresses, it can be IP addresses, it can be mail addresses, and the links go on. Once you have that initial, that big picture, instead of taking down a single website, you could actually take down 1,000 websites in the same operation or the same investigation. That's a significant disruption piece. Even if you cannot disrupt websites, you can extract the wallet addresses from those websites and give those wallet addresses, for example, give those wallet addresses to Kristen at Coinbase. They can take proactive action from their side, but you can also take all those active wallets and add those to your investigation. So suddenly your victim who has lost $1,000, which is devastating for them, you've actually now got an overall picture of maybe 40, 50, 100 million that's currently flowing through these wallets, which you can associate with websites which look exactly the same as the website that your victim has just reported. So your enforcement action has gone from $1,000 on one website to $1 million and 1,000 websites. That's a significant disruption to any criminal group. They have to rebuild their infrastructure. They have to rebuild their financial infrastructure as well. And all of that work to identify that can literally take a day. So it's not a significant drain on resources or personnel to do that piece of research, those pieces of work, and you just have to know where to look.
What advice do you have, like for, let's say, the NYPD or John's group at the Queen's DA's office? They're just starting off. They want to explore working the disruption angle. How is local law enforcement, who doesn't necessarily have access to a lot of high-tech resources or programs, what can they do to get started?
I think it's the first thing really, and I'm certainly not going to be telling anyone how to do their jobs. And I've been on the sharp end of frustration because I've not been able to do something because of local policy, federal policy, lack of funding, etc. But one of the first things is reach out to someone like yourself who's maybe getting a bit more exposure in terms of this particular field, who is maybe been able to bring on board a couple of tools or a couple of platforms that has assisted some of the investigations, because your budget works slightly different than a local law enforcement budget. But also don't be afraid to reach out where you're able to the private sector. Kirsten's mentioned they have lists of blocked wallet addresses. Your particular wallet address could be on that list of blocked addresses. And if that list is not public, then maybe they will make that public to you. Reach out to someone like myself who works in the domain name space, because we can very quickly tell you if your investigation is going to be 1, 2, 3 or 4 domains. It's actually going to be 100, it's going to be 1,000, it's going to be 2,000, and potentially provide that data to you. There is no law that I am aware of, or there is no skill that I'm aware of that says that a law enforcement officer researching a domain using the domain name space has any different legal judgment over the website than a private citizen doing exactly the same thing. Because at the end of the day, it will take a legal process later on down the line to decide whether the website is actually doing something illegal and so on, which is purely out of the private sector's hands. So the private sector really can provide a lot more context, a lot more detail, a lot more data, and dare I say it, probably quicker than maybe a 1-2 person office somewhere that's attached to a particular department. So don't be afraid to reach out. And a lot of the time, we will pass on best practices as well. We do not necessarily, the private sector doesn't necessarily have the same hindrance in terms of red tape, in terms of access to external websites and things along those lines, which law enforcement obviously has to have. So we can provide the additional context, additional training as well, which will be key to providing people with the right skills. An hour session on how the domain name system works, for example, can give investigators from a law enforcement side fantastic insights on how to link website A to links to website B, or why they cannot see website A after linking from website B, and so on. So collaboration is certainly the way forwards. And there are ways and means you can work around the red tape. Certainly when it comes to my space and the domain name system, I do not need to know the context of an investigation. I do not need to know any victim names. I do not need to know any victim addresses, phone numbers, and so on. None of that information will ever come up from the areas where I will look, nor is it important from my perspective to know any of that information. A website is essentially an open source piece of information that any person anywhere in the world could stumble upon at any given time. Just because a victim has reported that to law enforcement or an agency does not then disqualify non-law enforcement or non-law agency person from looking at that website. That website's still operating. That I could find that website accidentally 5 seconds after having a conversation with someone. So knowing that context is there and knowing how to obtain the data without violating, anyone's personal information or potentially providing sensitive information around an investigation is also another key factor. And that guidance can also be given by folks who are in the private space.
I'm really curious to hear what John and Inspector Nunez think about this disruption approach to combating all the pick butchering reports that we're seeing in New York, because it certainly isn't the historical traditional approach that law enforcement has taken. So John, just starting with you, do you think this disruption working model can be utilized by local prosecutor offices?
Absolutely, because I think for one thing, it is what we talked about, which is it's a way to get in front of this problem. It's a way to stop other people from becoming victims. And I think you yourself have experienced this when you've done these types of cases where you've taken down domains and seized domains, that you found that there were victims that you didn't even know about who were still engaged in that scam, who were ultimately protected because you took down the platform that the scammers were using and were able to shine a light on it. And I think that's where this becomes so critical and useful. Additionally, prosecutors' offices in particular were well positioned for this because our laws enable us to seize those domains. And so through legal process is how you go about doing this. In addition to providing registrars with domains that they should be blacklisting and finding other linked and related domains, we actually do have the legal authority and the ability to take these offline. And so we really need to be part of this process and be in this fight. And it should be part of our toolkit 100%.
Yeah, when my office was involved in a seizure of a group of 70 domains, one of the most effective things I found that came out of that was when we seized the domain, we replaced it with a page that said, this domain has been seized by the Brooklyn DA's office for violations of the law, et cetera. And that basically acted as like a red flag alert to the victims that were still actively interacting with that domain and had them reach out to us. So Inspector Nunez, similar type of question. Can you foresee the NYPD embracing this disruption approach and investing in the types of like training and tools that they would need to get it accomplished?
Yes, absolutely. And is with certain private sector businesses that do this kind of link analysis. Listen, being proactive against crime, whether it's street crime or cryptocurrency fraud scams, it's really twofold, right? Education, number one, because I always say the best type of crime is the one that doesn't occur. So you want to educate people so they don't become victims of crime. But the second approach, obviously, that doesn't always happen. The second thing is to try to be proactive by disrupting. And to do that, you need certain tools. And right now, the police department is in the process of obtaining certain tools that I can't really get into to try to help us combat cryptocurrency. So absolutely, education and disruption are the ways we're going to start battling and hopefully chopping down the amount of losses to cryptocurrency scams.
And Adrian, just to follow up, can that directly link to successful seizure as well? Are they interwoven?
They are interwoven. Even if you come across websites which are, let's say, hosted with an unfriendly registrar, someone who doesn't want to engage with law enforcement at all, or maybe they're hosted at a country code level, so a .us, .cc, .ru, whatever it happens to be, which makes seizing those websites problematic. Again, the fact that these websites have to be visible is key to the destruction pieces, because if you extract the wallet addresses from those websites and then provide those wallet addresses to every single exchange around the globe that's obviously law enforcement supportive, there are very few locations where that money can go. After that, there's kind of it's win-win. You may get the websites down, which is fantastic, and you may get the wallet addresses, which is fantastic as well. Or you may just get the wallet addresses and the websites themselves have nowhere else to go. But once you've identified the websites, and you've taken action against, let's say, the first batch of wallets associated with that site, if they reuse the site again, they will have to attach a new wallet to it. You're already there. You're already looking at that website. You're already monitoring it for any different changes. So you no longer have to go hunting for the websites. You're sitting there, you're watching it. So as soon as they change their wallet, literally within seconds, hours, days, depending on obviously your mechanisms, you can extract the new wallet address, and the cycle just repeats itself. And you can do this in reverse as well. If you have wallets but don't have the websites they're associated with wallets, you can do this in reverse and find the websites from the wallets. So it works really well in both ways. You can have this overall disruption, but you can also disrupt it piecemeal. You can take all the websites down, but maybe not disrupt the wallets. You can disrupt the wallets, but maybe not take the websites, or do both. So there's really no loss here from a enforcement or disruption perspective.
We are coming up on time, so I'm just going to ask the four of you. I'm just going to go around, starting with Inspector Nunez. And if you could just leave our audience with a key takeaway, or maybe something you hope to see in the future to get incorporated in the fight against big scam.
What I see in the future is that every law enforcement agency, prosecutor office is going to have at least a squad or a team, or more likely an entire unit devoted to cryptocurrency and involving crimes, investigating crimes that involve cryptocurrency. I've seen it before where crime trends have become, a permanent type of criminal enterprise that requires every single law enforcement agency, every prosecutor's office to have a unit dedicated to that. So I think that's in the future, that cards for prosecutors' offices and law enforcement agencies to have dedicated units for cryptocurrency.
How about you, Kristen?
We don't know what we don't know. So my key takeaway here for everybody is work with us. Information sharing is key. If talking to law enforcement, if you have victims that have provided the domains, have provided these addresses, we can block it over here. We can also help, and I don't know if this is help or hinder, but for your cases, we can help build out the victim population. So we can find other victims who might be associated with your one, and then build out a case from there. At the end of the day, just contact my team. We're here to help. We are a partner with you in this, because we don't want this activity on our platform as much as we don't want to see our parents, our siblings, our family and friends being victimized by this too. We're seeing all of these awful stories as well. So key takeaway here, work with us.
And John?
I am hopeful that what Inspector Nunez says is where we are heading, where the level of knowledge across the board increases as to what cryptocurrency is, how these scams work. And I do think that there's going to be a lot more dedication at the state and local level to understanding and prosecuting cases where cryptocurrency is at the very least a component. And I also hope that what the future holds is that we see a lot more collaboration and cooperation across platforms, both with the public and private partnerships, as well as different law enforcement agencies, not just across the United States, but also across the world, because this really is a global problem that requires a global solution and approach to it. It cannot be done by one DA's office or one police department, or even the United States Department of Justice and federal law enforcement alone. We require the assistance of law enforcement, policymakers, both here and globally, to really get our hands around this type of problem, because it really is one of a global nature. And I do think that attorneys of all stripes need to become familiar with cryptocurrency, because it's going to, we're already starting to see it on the private sector side in terms of bringing private lawsuits and things of that nature for victims of these crimes. I think that also is going to be a huge component of it, so that there are outlets and resources for victims.
Great. And lastly, Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo a lot of what's already being said, is that the private-public relationships have to be firmly established. There is a lot of focus on the cryptocurrency side, and rightly, because that's where the seizures can be made and that's where victims' finances can really be recovered. But obviously, from the actual overall the domain name space, the websites themselves, the ability to map and identify almost every single website that a particular scam organization is running at this particular moment in time not only helps the victims now, but also, as we've said before, the future victims, because a lot of these websites are registered with future operations in mind, so that the scam groups are working months ahead in terms of schedules. If you already know the websites are there, you can already take action against them or be waiting for them. I will echo what Kirsten said is we can help. We can help law enforcement. We can help investigations. We don't need the victim information. We just need the website. And then we can provide you with a lot of information that will save you both time and resources from your side.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I know I'm biased because I picked you all to be on this podcast, but you all did an excellent job.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be.
Thanks, Alona.
Always a pleasure.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen.